how much COVID has increased fraud and why it's important to us. All right. So now, e-commerce. How many of you buy stuff online? Do you do it regularly? I buy stuff online all the time. Actually, I should say my wife buys more stuff online than I do, but it is common to get a delivery every so often on my front step. As you are thinking about e-commerce, and let's look at it strictly from the vendor, the person, the company, the organization that provides the goods to you. What are the risks? Type in the chat box, what are the risks to the vendors by using e-commerce? Give me some ideas. What are the scams that can occur? Think about it. What are the scams that can occur involving vendors? So let's say you run an e-commerce business. Identity theft, absolutely, Mohammed. Fake websites, good job, Sultan. Hackers, credit card, fraudulent credit cards, hackers, websites. You guys are right on it. Skimming, you are right on it. Okay? Product purchase not as described. Great job, Yusuf. Card cloning, fake orders, credit card fraud. Now you're hitting all of the things that are happening. Quality, another great. Data privacy. All these things are important. And what we're seeing, if we focus on the perspective of the vendor, what we're seeing is on the left, substitute goods. So I have said that I've ordered a certain item, but now I get something that's less than promised, right? So it's almost like a bait and switch. And then have you ever ordered a counter or a designer item, and when it comes in, it's not the designer item that you expected, right? This just happened to us recently. My daughter plays volleyball, and she needed some sunglasses, and they have these things that call pit vipers. And so we found a sale on pit vipers. So sure enough, the package came in the mail, everything was fine, but when you opened it up, you could tell that it was a knockoff, a fake copy of the actual sunglasses. And so what we're seeing is an increase in this with COVID. When you order designer good, what's being delivered is something completely different. And then if we focus on counterfeit goods, focus on defective goods, and we apply this to COVID, imagine this. You go online because you are afraid of COVID. You have one of the risk factors that make it more likely for COVID to be a terminal event for you. It means that you're going to die. Now imagine you go online, you do the research, and you find that the N95 mask blocks 95% of the particles. And so you're like, that's what I need. And so what we do now, we order that N95 mask thinking that I'm getting the absolute best protection and it's what I need. But then when it comes, unbeknownst to you, because it looks like an N95 mask, it's not quality. And it's something less than an N95. So it maybe blocks 15% of the particles instead of 95. And you have increased your risk profile because you believe you're protected. As you can see from here, these are some of the things that vendors are doing. And then if we go to the other side from the customers, we have items not received. Here's something really interesting that's happening, okay? And I'm going to quote this when I got it wrote down. In 2019, in the United States, there was a $35 billion loss in items not received, which customers claim that I ordered this item and then they claim that it never arrived. Just in October of 2020 alone, the rate of items not received fraud went up by 67%. If I'm a vendor and I have an items not received or a customer claims an item is not received, look at the amount of money that's costing me. It's significant. It's going to be much higher than $35 billion this year. And then, of course, we have fictitious credit cards, which you all highlighted. Customer pays with a credit card that's not their own. And this is actually a trend that's been uncovered by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners in the previous 2 to 3 years. What we've seen is an increase a decrease in credit card present fraud. So if you go to your restaurant, you put in your credit card to pay for the meal, there's a decrease in fraud in those instances. However, there is a corresponding increase in card not present fraud, and that's your web transactions. So now what I'm going to ask you is, we talk about these things that you see on the screen right here. What are some protections we can take as auditors, as accountants, as fraud examiners? What are some things that we can do to prevent these schemes from happening? Whether it be internal controls, whether it be physical safeguards, what can we do to stop these frauds from happening in relation to electronic commerce? Give me some ideas in the chat box. Secure websites, absolutely, Sultan. If you're not having secured websites, you are taking risks. Data security is another great one, right? You get people's data. OTP alerts, very good idea. And you know, one thing we talk about with data security is a lot of companies claim somebody just took me off the chat. A lot of companies claim that they get all this data off the customers, including names and all this other stuff. One of the things that we found is, ask yourself from the business level, do you really need that? Oh, somebody's really moving me along. Hold on one second here. Somebody's taking over my screen.
We'll fix it, Bret. Just 1 second.
Okay. So anyway, what's happening is people are like, if we don't need that information, then let's not collect it. And what happens is a lot of organizations are collecting information, such as personally identifiable information that is not needed. So what we see there is, why collect the information if we don't need it? And so what's happening there, some other things that we can do. We'll just keep going while we fix this little technical problem real quick. You mentioned, trusted website. How many of you have seen encryption? I see one that's coming up here. Let's look at the chat. Delivery confirmation controls. We're going to talk about that, Ruth. That's a great idea. Adjust systems and kernel controls based on the recent schemes. Cannot use old systems to mitigate new risks. You're absolutely right, Rami. And so what we need to do is, we kind of, as fraud examiners, internal auditors, external auditors, accountants, whatever role you hold, COVID has caused us to go back and do completely different fraud risk assessments. When we're looking, where's the potential for fraud? Based on what you see, and in the next slide, you'll see a kind of graphic of the losses. We have to start considering that e-commerce and all the different things associated with e-commerce is a new risk area that has to be addressed in order for us to be successful in our job. Couple other things. How many of you have ever gotten the email or the text that says, hey, this is Amazon or whatever, Chase Bank, Lebanon Bank, whatever you have? It says, we have seen that your credit card has been charged with a fraudulent item. Please click on this link and we'll fix it. Phishing, absolutely right, Sultan. And what you're seeing is a ton of phishing efforts. What happens is, people have plenty of time on their hands. Now that people are working from home, they check their personal emails a lot more frequently, right? So these types of phishing schemes are starting to increase. If we're going to get, as Jad says, we're going to defeat those, we need to increase the awareness of our employees who are on our networks. We need to increase the awareness of our friends, our colleagues, everybody. And as fraud examiners, auditors, one of our jobs is to train and help people. Some other things that we haven't thought about. If you're going to use credit cards, we have to use that CVV code on the back, that little 3-digit number. It is very difficult for the credit card scammers to get that number, because that is not a record that is kept along with your credit card number and other information. So if you require that CVV code on the back, then Mohammed, still waiting for the Nigerian prince to send Millions. I'm right there with you, Mohammed. So that CVV code is important, the phishing code. There's also what they call RFID, radio frequency identification. So now let's say I have an electronic commerce store. There are devices that you can put on, small devices that are not that expensive, that can actually track the item. And so if you put it on the box and someone calls you and said, hey, the item never arrived, you have the RFID tracker, which can locate the item, and you can place it on that person's, apartment, their little mail receptacle, whatever they have, you can place it there, and that helps. And then in some cases, you will even see that the deliveries will actually take a picture of the box inside your mailbox or inside your little control device, right? Sultan says dropship scams have been widely spreading. And the other scam that's kind of, and we'll talk about this in remote work, we'll talk about some different cyber scams as well. All right, let's catch back up. There we go. There's the item not received fraud, so you can see the amount of the increase. Sometimes if you see it in person, or see it on a graph, it makes it even more powerful. All right, so we talked about how to mitigate it. Now let's talk about remote work. How many of you are doing remote work right now? Let me see if I can get the chat box back up. There we go. So John's definitely doing it. Philip's doing it. Yep. Double jobs remotely. Good for you, Hassan. Good for you. All right, so now what are some of the risks with remote work? If you are in charge of protecting your organization, what are some of the risks that you need to be aware of? Data privacy, again, Sultan, good. Data security, absolutely, right? Now, as we think about this, data confidentiality, good. Home internet risk, very good, Mason. Leakage of confidential home internet. How many of you know people who are working from home, electricity access, good. Network connectivity, good, good, good. Recording hours that aren't really worked, social engineering, these are all great ideas. How many of you know people that you work with who are not very good with computers, that always need that help? Are they a bigger risk to your organization than other people would be? Because you think about it, how many times have you updated your software? How many of you have talked to people who cannot work the computer, who need help? And now all these people are at home and they're trying to do their work. And how many of you have taken protection? How many of you have taken some kind of step to protect your home network? Anthony says, there's some companies still not ready to cope with working from home. Anthony, same thing in the US, right? If you don't have the proper protections, and frankly, some people don't even, old school people like me, Ali, old school people like me have trouble, right? This is the problem, because they're going to do things that they don't understand. Good. Hassan says these measures are taken by the technical team. That's good. Now, those of you who have updated your computer, how many of you have updated your routers? Ronnie, that's a great point. People represent the most vulnerable part. Because do you know that your routers have to be updated as well? Is your network at home? Is it designated public? Is it designated private? Here's an interesting story for you. In a few years back, Google took a step, and maybe some of you have used this, something called Google Street View, all right? In Google Street View, the idea behind it was there was a car equipped with a camera on top of it. And what it did is it traveled all throughout the neighborhoods of the United States, and they mapped the streets. So what they wanted to create was this giant web map of the United States. So basically, as the car came down the road, it took video of the houses, the streets, the offices, the trees, the parks, whatever it was that they passed, right? And everybody thought that was cool because now you could go back and look at an address and see the house on the address. But here's something that Google didn't tell you. When they were doing the addresses and taking the videos, they also had a device in the car that checked your network, your home network. And when they checked your home network, they were able to retrieve which websites you visited, which apps that you have, what was the password on your some of your devices, what's the network protocol that you use, do you have a Mac, do you have a PC, do you use Microsoft, do you use Apple, all these different things with simply just driving by with the right device. Now, imagine this. If you're an executive, oh, Imad says they know everything about you. You have no idea how much they know. But just think about this. If I do the research and I find out that your executive lives in this neighborhood, is it possible for me to just sit out at a place not too far away from the executive's apartment, flat, home, whatever the executive has, and have one of these monitors and possibly, if I haven't updated my router, if I haven't updated my computer, to get every email, every communication, everything sent from that computer? If we don't update our computers, if we don't update our routers, if we don't take certain protections in our Wi-Fi, then all that information is available. How many of you use public Wi-Fi? Give me a quick yes or no. Public Wi-Fi like at airports, at coffee shops, anywhere you go to. Sultan uses it. Everyone, right? Anthony says no, good. Samir says no, I get yeses and yeses, no's. All right, so if you use those little public Wi-Fis, are you checking to see if they're encrypted or not? Is there a password to use those Wi-Fis? Is there no password? Right? Because as soon as you get on a public Wi-Fi, people can access what you're doing. They can see it. It's not that hard. And so when I go to a coffee shop or something like that, I use their internet, but I also never do any work-related or any banking account information while on that network, because I know the likelihood of them encrypting it is not nearly as high and it's not as safe as when I do it at home, where I know my home network is encrypted. And there are people that will sit in these coffee shops with their computer or their laptop wide open and just monitor traffic. In fact, some of these enterprising fraudsters have actually created networks that look just like the existing network, but in reality are capturing every keystroke that you make. So for example, if we go back to Beirut, you go to the airport, you've got 2 hours before you board your flight because of a delay, and you decide, let me go on the airport Wi-Fi. And you look on the airport Wi-Fi and it says free airport Wi-Fi. And you click on that, you say, perfect. You know, and you check a couple things, you think you're safe. Well, if you look down the list of available networks, you see free airport Wi-Fi, and you also see Beirut airport Wi-Fi. Which one is real? Which one is fake? If you don't know which one is the actual airport ones, these fraudsters try to rename the airport networks or the networks to match whatever you're trying to do. And so Vana says, yeah, a kid is able to access your laptop through public Wi-Fi. Absolutely. Unfortunately, the kids are much smarter than me when it comes to cyber activity, right? And so then some people have started using what they call virtual private networks. Data is the new oil in the digital era. You're right, Sultan. And Sultan, I'll ask you, if you got Facebook, if you got Google, Instagram, any of those things, your data is being harvested, right? You're correct, Hassan, right? All this stuff is, you are the product. And we could get into the ethics of that in another session, because there's some really freaky stuff about what they do to get your information. But if you think about it, one of the ways to protect yourself, especially in using public Wi-Fi or using your home network, is the use of a virtual private network. That gives you some additional protections that you don't have with public Wi-Fi and other things. All right, so now let's start looking at remote work as far as office work, okay? How should we reassess risk for our organization, given that most people are at home? What are some ideas? What are some things that we should do to assess risk and our internal controls in our organization now that people are working from home? What are your thoughts? Should we questionnaire? Good. I like that, Anthony. So we're going to question, like, what's some of the things that you do, right? Because are there some inherent weaknesses, right? Formulate organizational regulations, what to do or not to do, protect the data. I like that. John says daily check-ins. Vulnerability of the systems, yeah. Maybe during the next pandemic, let's hope we don't have another one, Bass, not for a while. Vulnerability of systems, yep. So, does it affect us? Does it affect risk that we are not in a centralized location where our network activity can be monitored, or our home network can't be monitored like it could if we were in the office? And then how does that affect risk? That's a good one. Another one. How much of you, well, give me the answer to this question. Do you like not having your supervisor in the same office with you? Yes or no? What do you think? Because that's one of the increased risks. When you have people walking around an office, yeah, I get a lot of people who don't like the supervisor. Okay. Getting a few? Depends, right? But as you can tell, working at home, there's not as much oversight. And that can increase the risk of some of the things we're doing. Absolutely, Anthony, depends on the supervisor, right? But if I'm looking at it from the point of view of an auditor, a fraud examiner, an accountant, and I don't have that interaction with the supervisor, I don't have that layer of protection, does that increase the risks? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? And then lastly, how many of you are using Microsoft Teams, Zoom, WebEx, whatever you have, to talk about work and to do different things with work? Because I mean, I'm on Zoom, I'm on WebEx, I'm on Microsoft Teams all the time, right? Now we've got a bunch of people in here, and I'm sure you are all legitimate, but is there a chance that someone could sneak in on this conversation? We're not going to talk about anything that's too important, but if I'm talking about business, what's the chances that someone could sneak in without me knowing it? And we've seen a lot of stories throughout the world where people plan a Zoom meeting and all of a sudden it's taken over by a hacker, or someone comes in that we're not aware of. Now let's say that you work for a bank. Eli says it depends on the meeting settings. Absolutely. But is it possible that someone can override those settings? The answer is yeah, and it's not that hard. It's been done. Especially when you get people who really have never used Zoom or WebEx or Microsoft Teams. When you haven't used them, you're not aware of certain things. And so you're not aware of the protections that you need to put in place to make sure that no one can come. Renea says the man in the middle attack. Absolutely. So think about this scenario as a fraud examiner. I've got two banks in Lebanon that are talking about a merger. And I have snuck into the Zoom meeting and no one knows I'm here. Could I make a bunch of profit with that insider information? Right? This is the type of thing that is happening. And we haven't even been able to keep up with all these things. Now, there's obviously some other things. There have been cases where people have jumped into a Zoom meeting and played pornography tapes and stuff like that. That's no money to be made in Lebanon. Okay, amazing. Just to disrupt your meeting. Can it affect brand reputation? Absolutely. But Zoom meetings and these cyber risk are definitely something that we need to be concerned about. And Hassan says, selling information to competitors, absolutely. Trade secrets, business position. If you record that meeting, which is rather easy to do, that increases the risk. We as fraud examiners, as internal auditors, external auditors, accountants, we're responsible for assessing this risk. And now that people are doing remote work, it makes it much more difficult for us to control. All right, so moving on. Here we've talked about these. We talked about the questionnaire. We talked about use of home computers, your router's updated, your network's updated, all these things, right? So now, let's move on to the big one, financial statement fraud, okay? If we go to financial statement fraud, what, in your opinion, why is the risk of financial statement fraud more or less since COVID started? And tell me why. Give me your thoughts. Is the risk of financial statement fraud higher or lower? Okay, Mohammed says more. Why? Why is the risk of financial statement fraud higher? More pressure to perform. Higher companies need to achieve. Easier to be manipulated. Higher, yes. Companies are trying to look more profitable. Accountants less monitored by superiors. Meet profit numbers. These are all good. Harder to control, absolutely. Deterioration of results, right? COVID has had a definite economic impact, right? And so we're going to start thinking about, how does this affect us? How does this increase the pressure? If I told you that you had to take a 50% pay cut in your current salary, would that have an impact on your lifestyle? Most of us, it would, right? And so if an executive their income is partially based on earnings, is partially based on profits, bonus, does that start to affect how I think? Now, here's one of the things. I teach ethics, and I think I've taught some ethics at one of the sessions at the ACFE Lebanon conference. But just for a quick reminder, you and everyone else are not nearly as ethical as you believe yourself to be, right? And it's just natural human nature. And we get to that rationalization part. Here's an interesting study from Sridhari Desai. I'll put her name in there. She's done some studies on fraud. And one of the things that she found is that if you can, at the moment of temptation or before, right after, if you can remind people of their morality, then they become more ethical. And so what she found is that the emails, and I'm sure that some of you have seen these emails, somebody always has a message at the bottom, whatever message it is. What Sridhari and another woman named Miriam Kuchaki, and I'll put her name in there as well, they're both professors at colleges in the United States. And what they found is that if the organization puts a little statement at the bottom of every email that says something to the effect, it is better to fail with honesty than to succeed by fraud. Okay, one more time. It is better to fail with honesty than to succeed by fraud. The ethical profile of the organization increased significantly. So if you can just put that little reminder in there, then it makes people likely to maintain their ethical profiles, right? So she's got some interesting stuff. She talks about accountability also leading to more ethical behavior. But let's go back to focusing on financial statement fraud and some of the things that you may not have considered, all right? So there's your question. How should we reassess for financial statement fraud risk? What should we do? Should we take surveys? Should we just do more analysis? Because we're not in the office that much anymore. Any ideas? Go ahead, type in the chat. All right, let's get to the first one. You talked about increased pressure to perform. Does this lead to revenue recognition scams? Confirmations, support documents, right? Analytical data reviews, analysis, I love it. Double approvals. Reassess revenue recognition, there you go. Tracing and vouching. When you think about it, if I have an increased pressure to perform, then doesn't a revenue recognition scheme make a lot of sense? Because if I can recognize revenue earlier, then I can meet those goals. And if you look at behavior, most of us are really good with short-term thinking. But when it comes to long-term, we're not as good. And so this, I'll throw you another question. You don't have to answer this one if you don't want to. But here's the next question for you. How many of you have ever been on a diet where you wanted to lose some weight? And as you can see with me, my diets haven't been so successful, right? But if you can think about this, let's say that you decided yesterday to start a diet to lose some weight. And you've committed to that every Monday. Mom, it says I like that. You've committed to losing weight. And so that Monday, you come in that Monday morning and you said, I am going to follow this diet. And then it just so happens that when you come into that diet, that Monday you either you walk out of your house, you go into the office, you do whatever, and all of a sudden you just smell your favorite dessert. And you're like, ah. Oh. And you know, I've had Lebanese desserts, they're good. And so you smell it, and then you say, how many of you said to yourself, I'm going to start the diet tomorrow? And that's an example of how we think in the short term. And if we take this and apply it to financial statement fraud, and it's been done over and over again in the cases that I worked when I was with the FBI, if I increase or if I falsify revenue just this one time, then the next quarter I'll fix it. No, I just need to do it this one time, and then next month I'll fix it. So basically what that financial executive is saying is, I'm going to cheat on my diet just this one time. But as we all know, do we cheat on our diet, especially after we cheat on it the first time? And so what we have to do if we're going to start assessing risk in COVID, then we have to look at revenue recognition schemes. We also have to look at the opposite of that, and that is delayed expenses. Because either way, if you look at the calculation for income, if I increase revenue, it makes my income look better. If I decrease expenses, if I falsify those, it makes my revenue look better. So as I look at COVID, revenue recognition, I am really starting to focus on that because of the pressures. Jawad says pet projects, absolutely. All right, so now let's look at our earnings pressure. What can we do with earnings pressure to make ourselves look better? Well, what about manipulating reserves? Right? Many companies, as Mason said, many companies stopped delayed payments of expenses during COVID. Yes, because I need to look more profitable. I don't want to lose my job. How many of you can afford to lose your job? Not many people, right? And so I want those financial statements to look better than they actually are. And so reserves manipulation is another way to do it. And there was a company in the United States, a case I worked on, it was called Health South. Health South did about a $4 to $5 billion fraud. And initially, and the CFO has talked about this, when they decided to do the manipulations, because he never really decided to do fraud, the manipulation started with bad debt expense. And so what happened in the Health South case is they wanted to make a certain level of earnings per share. And when the actual numbers came in, they were short. And so the boss looks at them and says, I need you to meet this earnings per share expectation. Because if we do, the stock price goes up and my bonuses mean that much more. And so the accountants got together they started talking like, well, he wants to meet this. Are we a little bit too aggressive with bad debt expense? And they quickly talked themselves into it, and they adjusted the reserve. It was 2% of accounts receivable reserved for bad debt expense. They changed it to 1.5%. And lo and behold, they hit their number. Next quarter, they're short again. And so now what do? Well, let's change our bad debt expense reserve from 1.5% to 1%. And it worked. They met their earnings per share. But eventually, as they kept doing this, the bad debt expense was down to like 0.1%. Eventually, they ran out of ways to do it. But if I'm looking at it as from the point of view of a fraud examiner, I'm looking at reserves manipulation. And if I'm going to do analysis, I'm looking at, are the reserves at the same percentage they were in previous quarters? If not, is there a legitimate reason to reduce those reserves? If there is, okay. But if it's subjective, then I have to be a little bit more concerned. Absolutely a red flag, Sultan. Now let's look at the next one. Shrinking customer demand. Uh-oh. This means that people aren't buying stuff at the same rates. What does that lead to? Inventory misstatements, right? Inventory misstatements. But now, if you think about it, inventory is one of the areas where COVID fraud can just accelerate. Because if you're going to do an inventory, chances are you have to be with someone, you have to be in close quarters, you have to be in confined spaces, and that's the exact opposite of what is recommended for COVID. So inventory is going to be something that I watch big time. All right, and one more. This is the one that people don't think about, and that is the debt covenants, right? So most companies have loans, and in the loan documentation, there are certain percentages, certain ratios that the company has to meet. And if not, if they fail, if they fall underneath or go over the ratios, the bank can call the loan. In a time when cash is short, do you think that executives want to have to provide more capital to the lending authorities? Yeah. Philip, I think you may have the presentation. If not, I'll arrange for Mohammed and Serge to get it so they can pass it out to everybody. This is where timing differences come in. Revenue recognition, reserve manipulation, inventory misstatements, all this stuff. These are the ones I'm focusing on because of COVID, because there is less customer demand, there's more areas for manipulation, and timing differences are certainly something to be considered. All right, so now here's some solutions. Getting people who are familiar with forensic accounting is absolutely essential. What you're seeing, at least the trend in the United States in the last couple of months, is some of the big accounting firms are looking more and more at people who have forensic accounting experience. We just talked about a lot about how we need to reassess risk given COVID. We need to increase training. And then if you're not using data analytics yet, it can be so helpful. And there's a couple of companies, a couple of programs that are at decent cost basis. Now there's some that are just crazy out there. There's one I know in real-time data analytics that costs $200,000 US per month, which is just crazy, and only the bigger companies can afford that. But there are some cost-sensitive solutions that can help you. The advantage of data analytics is that they see things that we don't always see or catch on right away. The negative of data analytics is they don't always know what they're looking for. So some of the best companies have a combination of people with fraud and forensic accounting experience working with data analytics programs to get the best out of each of these. All right. So now let's talk about risks for internal and external auditors, okay? So I wanted to focus on this because I know not all of you are internal auditors or external auditors, but do you think that having less in-person contact increases or decreases fraud risks? In addition to not only less in-person contact, but less time on the actual premises. Do you think that increases or decreases? Imad says, what about resegregation duties within the department? I think that would help. Absolutely. I've got a bunch of increases here, right? Yeah. So, I mean, the risks, that we have is that we're not there. We're not interacting. We're not seeing certain things. One of the biggest red flags for fraud is that people live beyond their means. And yet, if we don't see that person, how do we know the lifestyle, right? And some of the ways that we get tips, and the number one way that fraud is discovered is through tips from employees or outside auditors, stuff like that. If I don't have that conversation, there's that passing conversation in the hallway, then I miss out on some of the tips. However, an interesting thing has happened. Whistleblower, absolutely, Molly. The government has done a study, and they have found that since COVID, the number of hotline tips that have come in to the agencies and the government have increased exponentially. Now, I want to see the research on this, and I want to see why, but I'm wondering if the very fact that we don't see each other kind of gets that group dynamic a little bit different. Because if I see someone, I bond with them, and maybe I don't want to be the one who discloses, but since I don't see that person anymore, does that make it easier for me to disclose? So I'm actively trying to find the research on that, and I'll give you my info later on if you want to just pepper me with a question every once in a while to see if I've found any studies to show why. All right? But all this stuff, COVID, remote work, the fact that we don't interact with each other, we don't have that office space, that shared space, it's having effects on fraud risk. And we're just now starting to figure it out. Now, if we've taken external auditors have also changed. They have been forced to look and reassess their audit steps because they're not at the facility like they used to be. They don't have the same meetings, the same contract. One thing that they're doing is instead of giving many of the duties to the new auditors, they're bringing in the partners and saying, you have to take a more active role in the fraud risk assessment and the actual steps of the audit. Why do you think that they're bringing in more experienced partners and having them to play a more integral role? What do you think the reason is behind that? Give me your thoughts. And Don says IT audit needed more. Absolutely. If you're not doing an IT audit, something's wrong. But why do they want more experience in the audit? Because usually they know CFOs personally, good. Usually the tasks for the audit are given to the junior accountants. More accountability, I like that, Muriel. Be familiar with the risks. Yeah. And you all have said that the risk environment has increased. And Hassan says they might have a greater idea about the solution process based on their experience. If you've had experience working fraud, does that help you recognize fraud? Doesn't mean you're going to catch every one of them, but doesn't it help you when you start to see something, right? And so by bringing in these people, these experienced auditors, now they're hoping that if I see a red flag, the experienced auditor is going to be able to recognize it much more quickly. All right. So now let's talk about coronavirus specific issues, okay? And I know we've got a bunch of different countries here, but I don't know whether or not your government is offering unemployment assistance. Because in the U.S., there's a lot of people outside that have lost their jobs, and so the government is trying to step in and offer assistance. Do you think that fraud is occurring in these programs? And the chat says, well, absolutely. And if your government is even if your government is not offering unemployment assistance, are there people out there who are trying to basically take advantage of those who are recently unemployed? Absolutely, right? In fact, there was I just read an article the other day about a woman who was called. She was an elderly woman. She got called and said, how would you like to get some extra money for job scams? Absolutely. How would you like to get some extra money from the unemployment assistance program that we have here? And of course, how many of you are going to turn down free money? Not me, right? And so what they end up doing is they get her to share her screen, go into her bank account, they get her passwords, everything, and then they take all the money out of the bank account, right? These are what's happening. The good thing for her in the article was that unbeknownst to the scammers, they had tried to scam an IT guy. And an IT guy played along with them, allowed them into his computer. But when you do that, it also allows the IT guy to be into the scammer's computer. So he put in a program without their knowledge and was able to track all this stuff and make sure that none of the money was transferred. Eventually, they found his program and deleted it, but I thought that was pretty unique, right? So what you have with this government system, with this job scams and stuff like that, is people are looking for help. So you have spoofed websites that look real, like they're actually from the government of the country that you're in, when in reality, they're not. You have spoofed phone calls where it says, I am part of the Lebanese government, and we are doing an assistance program, and we'd like to help you in this time of need. In reality, it's completely fake. They just want to get money out of you, right? And that last bullet point there, I found this remarkable, right? Since Corona has started, the United States has found 15,000 different fake tax revenue websites related to the United States Taxing Authority. 15,000. Now, that's the ones they've found. There's more out there. So how can we overcome this? Talking to people. We are experts in fraud. We are experts in scams. If we continue to alert people and make them aware of what's happening, we increase the chances that they'll catch on before they deliver their money. Absolutely, Molly. Social engineering awareness. And you'd be surprised, we talked earlier about the Nigerian prince that's supposed to send you millions and millions of dollars. There are still people today that are falling for these types of scams. We have to take our position as accountants, auditors, fraud examiners, to do that community outreach, to get people aware, because that's what's going to help stop this. If they're not successful, then they can't keep their scam operations open. All right. Whoops, skipped one. And then, of course, before we leave, I wanted to talk about COVID vaccination fraud. Right? Yes, Ellie says everyone's at home, so this is the new way to pick pockets. You're absolutely right. And the coronavirus vaccine is just the newest vehicle to take people's money. If you are scared of coronavirus, if you've not had coronavirus, I had corona in June of last year, so I've got the antibodies. I'm not too worried about the vaccine. But if you are in a high-risk environment, people are going to prey on the scam that says you need that, and I'm going to try to convince you to pay for this, even though I don't have it, right? There are so many bogus vaccine offers out there. You have to be very careful because these vaccines are difficult to get. Lastly, here is my information. If any of you would like to find me on LinkedIn, please do. That's my email right there, my phone number. If I can ever help you in any way, please do not hesitate to ask. And hopefully you have learned something new. Hopefully you've thought about behavior, and hopefully you've had some fun. Thank you to the ACFE Lebanon chapter for having me here. It's been fun. I hope the next time we meet, it'll be in person in Beirut.